see if I can remember the quotation. He said that it is in situations of intimacy, by which he often meant chumship, in situations of intimacy that there is validation of personal worth. And personal worth is part of what we mean by selfhood. So he was on both sides of that one. Wisely so, I think. The Buddhists also are on both sides. You know, the Buddhists love to say the self is and is not. It comes and goes. If God knows it does, doesn't it? And there are many people. Winnicott is probably the most quoted person along with Kohut on the nature of the self. Remember, there's the true self, glorious idea. And then there's the false self, which is not wearing your heart on your sleeve. It's social speech. It's keeping people from knowing, the wrong people from knowing too much. Then there's false personality, which is the old Reichian idea of character armor, where you really can't wiggle around much. Your true self is submerged by this. All those ideas are familiar. I myself, though, I think that was a valuable thing. I myself, though, think that there's a mistake in a lot of those that would help us both to forgive ourselves and also to be more realistic about patience. It springs from a remark that Abraham Lincoln made. Some of you may know it. Lincoln once said that no one is responsible, no one is responsible, said Lincoln. No one is responsible for their face until they're 40. Now, this is a tricky thing to understand, because I don't know whether you know how Lincoln felt about his face, but he didn't like his face at all. He thought he was a very ugly man. That extraordinary face was, for him, a source of great pain all his life. And the most famous example of it is another story probably known to you. Once during a courtroom battle, Lincoln was accused by the opposing attorney of being two-faced. And later on in the course of it, Lincoln went up to the jury box and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if I had two faces, would I wear this one?" Now this 40s, and I would say it's 50 or 60, at least, and certainly in my own case, in which one is responsible for one's face, is a fundamental, I think, correction. Because, and here we're getting toward the idea of struggle, which I mentioned earlier, because, what is the German philosophy? We're thrown into life, the sperm into the womb, the child into the school, we're thrown, and then we fall, that is, we collect our names, our attitudes, our neighborhoods, values, all these things are pumped into us, right? So we're not anything of our own. But later on, maybe, in the course of time, maybe we'll hear a voice or a call, and maybe we'll be ourselves. And then we might, maybe at 40, 50, 60, we might be able to say that we're responsible for our faces, at least a little, right? So it's a later thing. And I imagine it was very much a later thing for Harry Stack Sullivan to find a way through the terrible conflicts that he faced and to achieve in his struggle something useful, a persona, who he was, that we're all enormously indebted to still. And Elvin Semred was the same way. The Czech ethnic from Nebraska, so ambitious to get ahead, at the same time not eager to sell his soul. When the struggle was awful, I watched it with him day after day, and it was a very painful thing to do. But he held on, and he could remain a person in the presence of all this somehow or other. A struggle that all of us are in, I think, and lucky to achieve, and hopefully to achieve, probably more than we imagine we do, something that's useful. Now this, I was kindly asked to give this talk because of the Sullivan Society, and I have advice for the candidates. Like everybody else, I have advice for the candidates. Don't believe anything they tell you. I don't mean the candidates tell you, but the teachers tell you. Don't let them carry you away. Remember who you are or who you're becoming. Make sure that source of your own genius, your own intuition, your own strength, that isn't lost in the enormous educational opportunities, as they call them, of these schools, so that you too can have come out with the kind of thing that we owe to Sullivan or Semred or the other people that mean so much to us. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, and we don't believe anything they tell us except if it's Don Stern. So, anyway, I would like to thank Dr. Leston Havens for his directness, simplicity, and humanity, and also his tremendous sense of humor. Thank you. And now I'm going to introduce Don Stern. We asked Dr. Havens whom he might like as a discussant, and Don was his choice. And we'd like to thank Dr. Stern for being so generous with his time and agreeing to be the Sullivan Society's sponsored discussant for 2 years in a row. Dr. Havens is a really tough act to follow, but I think if anybody can, Don can. And though he needs really no introduction around here, I'm going to introduce him anyway. He is a training analyst and faculty here at White. He's supervising analyst and faculty at the Manhattan Institute of Psychoanalysis. Don is faculty at NYU postdoc. He serves on the editorial boards of Contemporary Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Dialogues. He's co-editor of the Handbook of Interpersonal Psychoanalysis, as well as Pioneers of Psychoanalysis. He's also the author of numerous scholarly articles and his own book, Unformulated Experience, From Dissociation to Imagination in Psychoanalysis. Don?
Yes, well. First of all, let me thank Dr. Havens for asking me to be here. Dr. Havens has published, in each of the last 5 decades, I learned over dinner. You now incidentally know why I had such a good time at dinner. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here with him. Now, I'm going to make this into a very unusual occasion. This is probably the first time that, see, you might wonder, why did I drag a sheet of papers up here? There's a reason. I'm going to read them. How in the world did someone write a discussion prior to a paper that hadn't been given yet? Good question. I did have access to 6 or 8 pages, the gist of what Dr. Havens said. And so what I've written is based on that. It's also the evidence, these pages, that I am not going to try to do what he did so successfully, and for that you should be grateful. Okay. Also, I'd like to thank the Sullivan Society for having me, and for the fact that this is the 2nd year. It's really very, very nice. Like many of us, I had a course when I was a candidate called The Difficult Patient. Actually, the course, which was a seminar taught by Amnon and Zasharoff, was in large part an attempt to decide what we were talking about. I remember the room we met in. It was the living room of Amnon's townhouse on West 95th Street. I remember who the other students were. I remember the structure of the seminar. Oh, there's one of the other students. We each selected 2 or 3 of the best papers we knew on the difficult patient, which would then be read and discussed by the whole group. I even remember some of those papers. What I don't remember is what the difficult patient was supposed to be. I have absolutely no idea what we decided makes a person difficult, or even if we decided at all. In this respect, that seminar was like many analytic treatments. You can think about this problem from what you imagine to be the perspective of your own patients, if you like, but you don't get too far that way unless you've gotten reports from patients many years after they've finished treatment with you. I have the choice, you see, of not seeing you very well or not seeing my pages. If I had my reading glasses, it might be easier to do, well, at least to see the pages, but you're going to have to put up with me having these on the end of my beak here. You don't get too far that way unless you've gotten reports from patients many years after they've finished treatment with you. Then, as we all know from the lore of our profession, if not from our own experience, you may hear that some insignificant thing you said or did, something you don't even remember, seemed to the patient to be the single most important moment of the treatment. These revelations are seldom especially gratifying to our narcissism, but most of the time they arrive so far after the fact that, at least in that way, they don't much matter anymore. One's already long past one's personal investment in how one conceptualized the case. In fact, one may not oneself remember the details, and be left, like the patient, with detailed memories of what can seem like arbitrary bits and pieces, and only gauzy, impressionistic notions of the marvelous bits of intelligence one can only assume one created at the time. I suspect that these observations mean that good teaching and learning, like good analysis, are more matters of doing than knowing. I think that Dr. Havens agrees with me on this point, though the point's much more complicated than this simple statement of it conveys. I think, as a matter of fact, that what Dr. Havens is writing about here, I wrote down, but we'll say talking about, and has been writing about elsewhere, both in the past and recently. I'm thinking now about an article he published last year in the Quarterly. And I'll have more to say about this in a little while. I'm reminded of another class that I took at White in the late 70s. This one on countertransference with Larry Epstein. On the first night of class in his office, Larry asked us a very simple question, but it was one that floored me so thoroughly that in this case I seem to have made an exception and remembered his particular verbal intervention all these years later. He said, "When you finish a treatment with a patient, what would you prefer for him to say about it? That he learned something or that he had an experience?" Well, I knew very well that Larry was too subtle to mean that these alternatives were mutually exclusive. And I also had no doubt about which of them he meant to champion. It is, of course, the same one that most appealed to me and no doubt to every other person in the room and to all of you as well. In that room, I mean. You have to remember that in those days, the idea that having an experience with this was the significant aspect of psychoanalysis was still somewhat radical. There had been voices like Gittleson and Lowald, of course. McLaughlin's famous article on psychoanalytic reality, transference and countertransference, was on the verge of appearing in print. And we were studying Winnicott and Fairbairn, not to mention, of course, Fromm, Crowley, Thompson, Tauber, Irwin Singer, and company here at the Institute, all of whom had made that point for many years. But the Freudian clinical project was still firmly anchored in insight, and even the interpersonalship, however much interpersonalists accepted relational effects in treatment. Now, I'm using relational here in its old-fashioned sense, meaning aspects of relatedness and not the type of theory that's called relational now. So interpersonal theory then was firmly anchored in even the interpersonalship, however much interpersonalists accepted relational effects in treatment, was just beginning to drift out of its own mainstream in the information value of the detailed inquiry. As a matter of fact, although we were all convinced that Sullivan was truly visionary in his concept of interpersonal relations and his focus on what actually happened, it was his overvaluation of objective data that many of us, certain of us at White, most of us members of the younger generation, at that time anyhow, that led us to try our hands at broadening interpersonal theory. We felt that Sullivan's legacy had left us with a too exclusive focus on fact and accuracy, and too little emphasis on the way in which the experience of both the analyst and the patient arose by itself from unconscious sources, which were both vague and invisible. Among this group were Steve Mitchell, Jay Greenberg, and Philip Bromberg. But these were just the few people who began their writing to address this problem. There were many others who felt the same way, especially those who'd been inspired by Fromm, as most of the first and second generation of interpersonalists were. Fromm's influence on interpersonal theory and on the White Institute in general is highly underrated, mostly because, though I know from those who knew him that Fromm taught passionately about clinical practice, he didn't write much about it. And so his name doesn't show up in the interpersonal literature anywhere near as often as his influence appears there. I had some reason many years ago to talk to a number of senior people, very senior people then, a number of whom are gone now, I asked them several questions. I think it was for having something to do with a newsletter at the time. And one of the things I asked was who their most influential supervisor was, and every one of them said Fromm. And those are the people who taught us. So Fromm's influence is I think, much more palpable here than we usually, we certainly acknowledge it, but I think it's part of our work in a way that we don't actually think about as much as we should. Harvey Rosenblatt was one of those people who thought this way, who did a wonderful job of teaching the same course on clinical process that Philip eventually took over, was one of the people who was sympathetic to an interpersonal perspective that had a prominent place for the self and the generative unconscious. Among my other teachers who would have felt that way, I think of, besides Amnon and Larry, David Schechter, Erwin Singer, Paul Lippmann, Lee Caligore, Max Deutscher, Ed Tauber, Ben Wolstein, Art Feiner, and of course Ernest Schachtel, who died before I had the good sense to seek him out, but became a primary source of inspiration to me. And even this list is highly selective because it comprises mostly just those who expressed such views in my presence. Many other faculty members at the time, maybe even most, found the new directions, such as the relational critique and constructivism, intriguing, if not downright exciting. And so when I say that the mainstream of interpersonal theory here at White in the late 70s had to do with the accuracy and information value of the detailed inquiry, what I really mean is the expressed mainstream. There was something else very much in the wind in those days, something I might even be tempted to call unformulated. It was in this kind of environment in the late 70s that Dr. Havens visited us for what I think was the first time. Actually, at dinner, I think we decided it was 1978. Yeah. His book, Models of the Mind, had come out several years earlier, and Participant Observation had just been published. I was a candidate then. In fact, we also figured, and you get to a certain age, many of you are at that age, some of you are younger than that, and some of you are old enough for this to be old hat. But you get to a certain age and you think to yourself all the time, if you're like me, let me see, when my father was my age, I was, and then he was doing, and so it turns out that when I am now the age that Dr. Havens was when he came to the White Institute the first time. It was one of those little interesting and mildly disturbing things that I was a candidate then, a young and very enthusiastic one. I had moved to New York from the Midwest to become an analyst, and I had chosen the White Institute. I had no other reason to be in New York, and so I did everything there was to do around here, and certainly attended every single scientific program, which in those days were usually limited to papers by members of the White Society. We don't do that anymore, but that was the way the programs used to be all the time. Dr. Havens was an exception, someone from the outside, which made his appearance all the more interesting to me. I remember being fascinated by his presentation. I think it appeared a little later on in Contemporary Psychoanalysis. And we were all grateful for it, and for the views that underpinned it. For although Sullivan had been so highly influential during his lifetime, and soon after it, his influence had declined dramatically in the years since then. And Dr. Havens was one of the few highly visible analytic writers outside our own group to take him seriously. One of the few analytic types who didn't dismiss Sullivan's work as the dreaded radical environmentalism, which is a euphemistic term that was meant to be the worst kind of condemnation while masquerading as mere description. For an analyst to call someone an environmentalist in those days was something like what it means today when a Republican regretfully concludes that he has to describe someone as a liberal. In fact, in the late 70s and early 80s, enthusiasm for interpersonal psychoanalysis sometimes seemed so rare in the analytic community at large that I can remember being somewhat embarrassed by the frequency with which I read a quotation from Dr. Havens. It was from Participant Observation, I think, to the effect that Sullivan was the invisible bulwark of American psychiatry. I'm sure you know the remark I mean. The very frequency of the citation of this single remark, it seemed to me at that time, sometimes made it look as if Dr. Havens was the only person outside White who had positive feelings about Sullivan and his influence. Of course, that's all changed today, and it's changed quite dramatically. But those were the bad old days. But to tell you the truth, in the tradition of the lost detail I've already mentioned, I don't remember so much what Dr. Havens said that night, 20-odd years ago, as I do his personal presence. Now you know why I say that. I remember a man of intensity and intelligence who radiated interest in other people. What I was especially glad to see, and what I had hoped to see on the basis of his books, was someone of unusual curiosity and perhaps wisdom. I did. And I see the same quality in the paper we've heard tonight. Dr. Havens is not one of those people who seize a theme and work it to death, publishing one variation after another. He doesn't write, I suspect, nor I presume does he think, by figuring things out. In my imagination, the person who lies behind the experience near piece Dr. Havens has presented to us tonight tries to put himself in the presence of things that interest him, and then he waits to find out what he'll think about them, what he eventually will have to say. This means of composition is dear to me, probably because I have absolutely no choice but to use it myself. I can no more figure out what I'm going to want to think than I can decide on the moment when I'm going to go to sleep. I imagine Dr. Havens to have no more choice in these matters than I do. There are people who can decide what they're going to think about and who know exactly what they're going to write before they write it, so that when they sit down to work, they're simply putting in effort on a project that already exists. I greatly admire that ability, which I would call incisive or analytic or critical, because it allows an especially lucid kind of engagement with the underlying logic and implications of the issues before one. But most of the time, it's entirely beyond me. I usually have to wait until that kind of analysis opens itself to me, and you don't even want to know how many detours there are on the way to such a thing. It sometimes takes a long time. Same thing goes on in treatment. I usually feel I don't know exactly what's going on with the patient, and I'm waiting to have something useful or interesting or helpful to say. I want the treatment to have a unity, of course, an internal consistency. But if it does, it is not and cannot be, in my way of thinking, because I have, or any other analyst has, set out to create such a thing. As a squash partner of mine likes to say, shrugging his shoulders after making an especially marvelous shot that may or may not be his actual responsibility, it's better than skill. This is not to deny our capacity for expertise. What I mean is that if the treatment has unity, it's because the patient and I have managed to latch on to significant themes that then organize our participation in a way that we eventually judge to have had this quality of unity or organization. But you can only make that judgment of unity or its absence in retrospect. We usually have an overarching, detailed, and organized view of the patient, of course, one we could cite if need be, either inside or outside the session. But the work itself is almost always done without reference to any of this. You seldom, sometimes yes, but seldom, think of the words transference and countertransference until sometime later, after the session. Within the session itself, there is only the patient's experience, your own, and the interaction of the two. The clinical experience has its own direct kind of reality that I think probably should not be abstracted or intellectualized too much, if at all, until later. Don't get me wrong. I think very highly of the intellect. I think that genuine intellect, which is thoroughly imbued with affect, is crucial to the kind of clinical work Dr. Havens does, and that it's my aim to do myself. As a matter of fact, I would claim, for example, that it was an act of the imagination, and thus of intellect in the very best sense, for Dr. Havens to have made the clinical judgment with a young woman who taught poetry to children that he needed to wait until it felt natural to make a spontaneous remark. I have no quarrel with intellect at all. It's just intellectualization I'd like to avoid. I think that this way of approaching the world shows not only in Dr. Havens' writing, but in his clinical work itself. With the anxious young woman I just mentioned, for instance, he sat and he waited until he knew what he wanted to say. To speak from the heart, while staying within our role as analysts, is what we often aspire to, of course, but we're not always able to do it. Quite often we're not able to do it. There's always the temptation to try to accomplish something, to force the issue, to make something happen. It is usually much more satisfying, at least to me, to wait like Robert Frost in the woods, to find out what will occur to us. And despite our romantic notions to the contrary, that's not right. And despite our romantic notions about the difficulties of maintaining that kind of openness, it's not necessarily any harder to do that than it is to force things. Waiting this way was not Sullivan's ideal, I think. At least certainly he wouldn't have consciously embraced it. It may have more to do with the way he worked than he thought, but I don't think that's what he would have said. But it is mine, and so I sympathize with Dr. Havens' presentation. The main point of Dr. Havens' presentation is that we should not try to identify difficult patients in isolation. This he had more to say, I think, about in the part that I read than what he talked about here. But you'll see where I'm going, and I think it'll connect up well enough. We should instead define who difficult patients are, at least partially by reference to their analysts, or better, by reference to the field they establish with their analysts. You can't judge whether a particular patient is difficult without reference to the interpersonal field within which the psychotherapy takes place. The difficult patient is the one whose truth, whose most real aspects, the analyst can't find a way to respond to. And so my difficult patients may be different than yours. Dr. Havens does not point out the obvious fact that there are some groups of patients who tend to be most difficult for many of us, virtually all of us as a matter of fact. But that word virtually is important. The example of Sullivan, whose success with paranoid patients fascinated Dr. Havens enough to motivate him to write Participant Observation, shows us that even the patients who are difficult for almost all of us are not difficult in that special sense for some of us. I realize as I write this that I've actually already given you an example of what I think Dr. Havens means in what I've said about myself. I am no doubt best with patients I don't have to know what I'm doing with every moment. People I can help by being curious and interested without being called upon to make anything happen. I have no doubt that there are patients out there who need an analyst whose thought is more consistently planful than mine is. Such a patient would be harder for me, though perhaps I could stretch to reach him or her. Dr. Havens is careful to make the point that personality is by no means necessarily destiny in this respect, that clinical work is not always a matter of already being what the patient needs, but of trying to learn what the patient needs us to do and trying to stretch to do it. Now, I think what he'd say is it has to be somehow, somewhere within your repertoire, but there's a good deal of room for stretch. Is this true? You can tell us later. It's a matter of how to do what the patient needs, no matter what you already are. Dr. Havens tells us to be alert to those of the patient's influences on us that might have something to teach us. All of this adds up to a very interpersonal perspective. The patient's difficulty has been contextualized. Dr. Havens wants us to consider that patients get better and analysts do good work by tapping their strengths, by learning who they are and being that way as fully as they can. Though the argument does not actually address the idea of technique, and I think that he would want to stay away from it, it is a contribution to the growing groundswell that there's no particular single thing or set of things that one absolutely must do if to call one's work psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. Ed Levinson was one of the earliest on this scene. He's been arguing since the early 70s that the only thing analysts accomplish by believing that they control their impact is keeping treatments from developing wings of their own and taking flight. Steve Mitchell writes about therapeutic action as the task of finding out how to be a particular patient's analyst. The central point of Erwin Hoffman's brand new book is that analytic technique, which he calls ritual, derives its meaning from being one part of a dialectic, the other term of which is the analyst's spontaneity, so that they take their meaning from one another. Whether it's free association, the couch, a particular frequency of meetings, the traditional notion of analytic neutrality and anonymity, and its corollary, the verboten gratification of transference, or the idea that interpretations must be timed in some specific way, all technical recommendations have been contextualized. We now ask what it means to do these things with this or that particular patient. What does it mean in the transference? What's it mean in the countertransference? Because we know that we can't know much of the context into which we deliver our participation, that is, that much of it is hidden from us. We can't know it directly, including that part of the context that's determined by our own unconscious involvement. Our clinical interest today often lies less in our conscious intentions than in the effects of what we do. We no longer take the position, as some analysts did such a short time ago, that analysts can be held responsible only for properly carrying out standard analytic technique, and that if patients do not get better when analysts behave properly, it's regrettable, but certainly not the analyst doing. At least in our theories, we're much less likely today to blame patients for treatments that go awry. In most cases, we've rejected the accusational and falsely objective concepts such as the adhesiveness of the patient's libido or the negative therapeutic reaction that used to be used to explain why patients didn't get better in treatment with competent analysts. It's a negative therapeutic reaction, but it really doesn't mean anything. Let me go back to an idea I promised to return to, the one about psychoanalysis is doing, as opposed to psychoanalysis is knowing. I think Dr. Haven's thinking here is a contribution to the very widespread broadening of our theories of therapeutic action. Long gone are the days when it made any sense at all to argue about whether mutative factors derive from relationship or insight, as if the answer needed to be one or the other, or could be. No one thinks that way anymore. There's a conference coming up in February, the PEP-CD-ROM conference, named after the psychoanalytic publisher, the disc that has all the journals on it, which if you don't know about it, maybe in discussion we can talk about it because it's very valuable. It has 6 journals on it all the way from their inception to 1994, I guess. And you can put it in your computer and have instant access to every article in all those journals. And last year they did a conference, the people who put this CD-ROM together did a conference at Sinai on the seduction theory, and this year it's on therapeutic action. So that's what I'm referring to. There's a conference coming up in February at Sinai that will address the concept of therapeutic action. It's entitled Reflections on Analytic Hours, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. A number of people from White are participating in this meeting. I mention it because Glenn Gabbard's paper on Friday night of that weekend is a very good review of the interrelationship between insight and relational effects. He takes the very reasonable position that we no longer think in terms of there being a single kind of therapeutic effect or a single kind of theory, but instead many kinds of effects and theories. In fact, I think this is probably less a position than a recognition of an existing consensus. The thinking on this point has gone far enough that I think we even take it for granted today that it's time to talk not only about relational effects, but about many different kinds of relational effects. So, it's a relational effect that Dr. Havens is proposing, since his view of therapeutic action depends not only on what the analyst's character allows him or her to understand about the patient, or, as he would prefer to put it, who the analyst is, but very significantly on what that understanding allows the analyst to do with the patient. But what is the nature of this doing? How should we characterize what the analyst is actually doing when she responds to what's most true or real about a patient? It's certainly not any kind of reparenting Dr. Havens is after. In fact, what he's proposing doesn't have developmental roots at all, I think. That is, Dr. Havens' vision of what's essential about therapeutic doing has nothing to do with the resumption of truncated processes of growth. Therefore, what he's talking about is not the kind of relational effect that derives from the object relation school, works such as Winnicott's, or the self-psychological work of Kohut and the elaborators of self-psychology, or the ego-psychological work of thinkers like Gittleson, Spitz, and Lowald. I should probably stop there and say that it's my understanding that he would probably say that these people, it's not that he would take issue with whether these people did good work. He would say that there's something in their theories about, I suspect, something that they know from the inside that they happen to codify in that particular manner, which is true of all theory, I think. Neither does Dr. Havens wish us to understand his therapeutic doing as primarily an authentic or affectively engaged response to the patient, as suggested by certain other writers, such as Darlene Ehrenberg. Although it would include that. I have no doubt that Dr. Havens would agree on the necessity of authenticity and affective engagement, but they are not what he's telling us about, at least not all he's telling us about. I suspect his attitude toward them would be that while they're necessary, they're insufficient, and probably less often purposefully effected than hoped for before their occurrence, and gratefully accepted after the fact. Nor is the point of Dr. Havens' endeavors to arouse the patient's recognition of him as a new kind of object, as many relational theories portray the analyst's doing as being. Though once again, I'm also quite sure that Dr. Havens would accept that when he does manage to accomplish his aim, being recognized as a new object is one of the outcomes. Dr. Havens' work should be described as intersubjective, but he's not as interested, I think, in analyzing the details of the clinical transaction as many interpersonal and relational analysts would be, nor would he, I think, describe himself as a constructivist, as most relational analysts and some interpersonalists would. He doesn't portray therapeutic action as the result of either participating in unconscious enactments or analyzing them. He does cite Levinson approvingly, but his reading of Levinson is quite different than mine. He writes that Levinson, this is a quotation from that paper, Levinson suggested that in entering the new social field created by engagement with another, we be alert to possible transformations of our integrity. In Buber's word, we must withstand. And he mentioned here Levinson's idea of resisting transformation. This passage seems to mean that Levinson believes transformation can be avoided, when, in my reading, Levinson's point, even in his first book, but especially after that, is that the transformation of the analyst is precisely what cannot be avoided. The analyst can only try to be aware of these transformations in which he actively participates so that he remains intellectually and emotionally open to characterizing his analytic participation in ways that have inadvertently fallen into the patterns the patient has brought to the treatment. Transformation is precisely what cannot be withstood. Do I seem to have eliminated all the ways we have in contemporary psychoanalysis to categorize relational effects? Almost. There is at least one important category left, though, one that we don't discuss as often today as we did 20 or 30 years ago. To my mind, Dr. Havens, and although he didn't say so in the paper, he made that quite clear in his remarks tonight. To my mind, Dr. Havens is an existentialist, one for whom the commitment closest to the bone is the commitment to the individuality of human beings. In this respect, he belongs to the same tradition of humanism that inspired Fromm's writing, that was represented later on through so many decades by Benjamin Wollstein, and that at White is now in the hands of writers such as Warren Wilner, John Fiscalini, and I think Darlene Ehrenberg. This irreducible self, Dr. Havens has written elsewhere, cannot be grasped by a psychoanalysis that's exclusively either scientific or subjectivistic. Science studies phenomena only from the outside, and so it can't grasp subjectivity, because obviously that's somewhere else but the outside. And theories of subjectivity often study experience only from the inside, and so may not be able to formulate the important truths about a person that go beyond anyone's capacity to see herself. What we don't see about ourselves is not just what we refuse to see. There are many aspects of ourselves that we have never had a reason to formulate in language, aspects that are best described as ways of being. These ways of being are often strengths, because they've been developed over the many years it's taken each of us to cope with whatever life has thrown in our paths. It's Dr. Havens' primary intention to contact and respond to the ways of being that lie at the core of a personality, thereby, he hopes, both seeing how the patient's most important ways of being, in fact, what I would say here is most important ways of being in the world, expose him to special problems, as in the case of the anxious young woman, and bring to bear on these problems the patient's most profound resources. One of the points that I found moving in the paper that I read, that I think was less clear tonight, is that what he's trying to do in contacting these strengths is what I'm saying here. I'm going to repeat it, though, for the sake of emphasis. The strengths, if the patient can learn to recognize strengths that she has that she wasn't aware of, she can then bring them to bear on her own problems in a way that allows growth more effectively than just about anything else. This is one of his points. This process may very well end up provoking a linguistic formulation of what's being contacted, and the patient's new knowledge of herself may very well end up being important to her future life. But I suspect that Dr. Havens would say that it's the making of this contact, the therapist's actual and deeply informed response to the patient, that's the most significant therapeutic agent here. In other words, I think that Dr. Havens belongs to the same zeitgeist that began here at White at about the same time as his first visit, the one that I mentioned in the beginning of these remarks. I think he too, like all of us in Larry Epstein's seminar, if he had to make the choice, would choose analysis to be an experience. Perhaps he'll tell us later on if this is so. For a little while, I've been playing around with an idea that seems to me to be related to what Dr. Havens has said tonight, and I'll end with it. The idea has to do with questioning the extent to which we privilege the foreground in clinical work. And it harks back to the point about all those positive therapeutic effects we have no idea we contributed until patients tell us about them years later. What I mean by privileging the foreground is our assertion that it's what we know we're doing, the foreground of our work. It's not always what we assert, but it's a major part of a psychoanalytic assertion, and it's certainly the basis of any notion of technique. What I mean by privileging the foreground is our assertion that it's what we know we're doing, the foreground of our work, that's responsible for therapeutic action. We privilege the foreground when we discuss the mutative effects of analytic interpretation, insight, and the dissolution of resistance. On the other hand, there's the background of our work, by which I mean to refer to all those aspects of what we do and participate in without consciously intending to do so, and often even without noticing. I think this would also include things that we consciously know that we do, intend to do, but don't necessarily know that we're going to want to do. Things that come to us quite spontaneously. We've certainly brought the background into the foreground in certain important respects over the last few decades, with the centrality that we've assigned to the analysis of countertransference, including the perception and understanding of enactments. But I've been playing with the possibility that one of the main benefits of the therapeutic task itself might actually be to bring two people together in pursuit of a commonly defined goal, a foreground, so that the unintended and perhaps equally or even more powerful background effects can take place unimpeded. All those affectively intense transactions that make up the unexpressed background of treatment are really only possible, after all, because they're incidental. Love, affirmation, containment even, and even the analyst's expression of anger when it happens to be useful. All those transactions that are mutative either because they offer a transactional alternative that surprises the patient into a recognition of his transference expectations, or because they fill some developmental need, are only mutative because they're authentic. And they're only authentic because they happen without conscious plan. Once again, I must make sure it doesn't sound as if I'm claiming that the analyst's conscious intention is unimportant to the therapeutic outcome, because I think it would be silly to say that. It would be irresponsible. It shouldn't even need to be stated that the analyst's planful conduct, including consciously embraced affective responses and affectively charged stances, play a crucial role in any treatment. What I do want to suggest is that when the analyst, in a calculated way, depends for a therapeutic effect on the adoption of a particular emotional stance, trying to provoke the patient to have a particular feeling and response, the patient knows it and therefore finds the attempt unconvincing, however honorable it may be. The most obvious example here is Ferenczi's experiment with reparenting, which it has been argued, most recently I remember reading this in a paper in Contemporary by Karin Marotta. The most obvious example here is Ferenczi's experiment with reparenting, which it's been argued failed precisely because Ferenczi ignored what had to have been his angry response to his increasingly manipulative and desperate patients and offered them instead a contrived and guilty love. This love was intended to make up for what the patients hadn't received in childhood. Instead, we now feel sure that while Ferenczi's patients may have understood that his intentions were good, they also understood that he couldn't possibly have responded to their outrageous demands with the generosity he wanted to convince them and himself was genuine. And so his love just disappeared into the structures of the transference. To the extent that Franz Alexander's corrective emotional experience was supposed to be inspired by the analyst's consciously designed attempt to behave counter to the patient's transference expectations, he goes back and forth about this. It's been a long time ago now, but he did try to figure out the transference, and they'd say, well, what you have to do is you have to behave in a different way than that, but quite consciously and planfully. To the extent that that's true, this technique failed for the same reasons. The corrective emotional experience isn't dead. It's alive and well. It's just that it must occur incidentally. Here I return to Dr. Havens's point about what makes patients difficult. The consciously chosen task of treatment, the foreground, that is, the description and investigation of a life, can be done in many, many ways, only some of which are appealing or useful to any particular person, or even possible to carry out with that person. The idea I'm toying with here is that what makes a treatment viable, what makes patients workable or difficult, is not so much whether we are the right kind of person to be able to establish a relationship with the person in question, but whether we can imagine, present, and maintain the very particular task of treatment sensitively enough to make it bearable to the patient or even compelling. This is, of course, a relationship of a sort, but it is a very specific kind. If we can manage to do this, there is a basis on which the affectively charged background of treatment, which analyst and patient eventually create together, may come into play quite naturally and by itself. Take Sullivan's work with paranoid patients. Using what Dr. Havens has called counterprojective technique, which of course, as we're all familiar with, Sullivan himself didn't call it anything, he just called it what he did. Using what Dr. Havens has called counterprojective technique, Sullivan, because of who he was, found a way to adapt the therapeutic task to these people's strengths and limitations. He found a way to do something with them, something that all concerned could agree was a good idea. He capitalized on their capacity to observe other people's hidden motives and minimize their terror about direct affective involvement. These treatments may have been the first stable relationships these people had had for many years. Can anyone doubt that the relationships Sullivan made possible with these men were any less therapeutically beneficial than whatever was learned within them? But then consider, could anyone, even Sullivan, have set out to have a